Everyone. I'm Melory Johnson, 25-year beauty veteran, consultant, and strategist. Welcome to Pretty Equity, where we tackle the real issues facing beauty founders and investors and bring you the answers from the experts behind the deals. One of the most persistent regulatory issues I run into with founders, CMOs, and even seasoned teams is confusion around labels versus labeling. Many people assume compliance lives on the package, where in reality, the FDA takes a much broader view, and that misunderstanding is often what turns a cosmetic into a drug or a low-risk product into a regulatory nightmare. So today, to help me unpack it all, I'm joined by Sheppard Bentley of Bentley Biomed. Shep and I originally tackled this topic together for a journal article in the context of medical devices, but the principles that apply to the med device sector apply just as strongly in beauty. The conversation you're about to hear is about understanding how words unintentionally create regulatory risk. Before I dive in, however, I want to start by clearing up the core misunderstanding and level set something for our non-US audience. While regulatory frameworks differ by region, one principle is fairly universal. What you say about a product can change how it is regulated. In the US, the FDA takes a particularly expansive view of this, and many founders are surprised to learn that compliance doesn't stop at what's printed on the package. That's why this distinction about the difference between label and labeling matters so much. With that, Shep, thank you for being here. At a
My pleasure.
fundamental level, what is the difference between a label and labeling under FDA law?
Labeling is the extension of the label. So let's talk about the label first. The label is what is actually printed on the product. It goes there, it identifies the manufacturer, the product itself, and it often asserts the indications for use. And that is what the label is. Very, very basic, very, very specific. Labeling is the promotion of that product, and oftentimes is what can be identified as printed in the marketplace, whether it's at trade shows, whether it's in advertising, whether it's in open discussions where there could even be closed captioning of what's being said as printed. The idea is that it's what you're doing to promote your label. So labeling is everything beyond that actual small item that goes on your product.
Okay, so once you understand that a product's label is only one little piece of the puzzle, the natural next question is, why does the FDA care so much about everything else? And the answer comes down to something called intended use.
Mhm.
From a regulatory standpoint, intended use isn't determined by what a company says it meant to sell. It's determined by what the product is represented to do. And that representation can come from many places. Okay, so let me pause here and simplify this because this is where a lot of founders get tripped up. Most people think the FDA looks only at what's printed on the product label, the box, the bottle, the tube. But in truth, from a regulatory perspective, the label is just one small piece of information. What the FDA actually cares about is what the product appears to be for, based on everything a consumer hears or sees about that product. So, as Shep just said, even if a company says, we didn't intend for this to be a drug, that doesn't really matter to the FDA. If your website, your ads, your social media posts, your influencer videos, or even the customer FAQs suggest that the product treats, prevents, or fixes a medical problem, regulators may classify it that way, regardless of what you meant. What I'm saying is that the FDA doesn't regulate intent. They regulate how a product is presented to the public. And that is why founders are often surprised. They think they're selling a cosmetic until they realize that their marketing language quietly pushed the product into a different regulatory category. That's why labeling isn't just about what's written on the package, it's about controlling the full message about your product. In other words, the totality of how a product is presented to the market. So, as far as the FDA is concerned, the brand is responsible for all their marketing, even and including likes on social media, customer testimonials, yes, and of course, how salespeople respond to customer questions. A single phrase, a marketing angle, and an off label use suggestion may quietly shift how a product is classified without anyone realizing it until it's too late. With all that said, Shep, you've spent years working at the intersection of labeling, claims, and regulatory enforcement. And you've worked with brands that didn't realize, or worse, did but didn't care that they crossed the line. So the audience can understand better. Can you please walk us through how regulators actually infer intended use and what brands most often get wrong?
Absolutely. And I just want to mention it's because the mission of the FDA is to protect the public health. And so, in doing so, what the FDA is charged with doing is ensuring that the public, as it's being exposed to the label, oftentimes that's the last thing that they understand about the product. If they ever see the actual label of the product, they may see that when it's dropped off at their doorstep from Amazon or whatnot, but they may not ever be aware of the label until after all the exposure to the labeling. So the labeling is what creates the sale. And if the labeling is off label, which is to say it's beyond what the label is saying, that's off label promotion. And that's very, very, very bad. And the FDA will look at the off label promotion as being a problem that is disallowing the public to make its proper choices in selecting the product that it needs for itself. If an individual is suffering from a condition for which that product is being offered off label without proper investigations, without proper support from clinical science, from data, from clinical information, or anything like that. And it's just a wishful aspiration for that product to be able to do that, oftentimes based on a handful of testimonials that have come back from use where even in the case of individuals, maybe it was part of a placebo effect or something where they thought they were getting the benefit from that product, but it had absolutely no scientific justification. That is where the FDA steps in and says this product that is being offered to the public is being promoted without the proper label. So the label itself, that connection of the label to the person that's using the product is essential. And anything beyond that is off label. Now, I will say that the only way that innovation ever happens is by investigation. So you do that the proper way. You take something from the support of a label to the next level, but you don't do that without coordination with the FDA, with investigational new device or new drug clinical trials. That is how it's done. It's not done by getting feedback from the market, say, oh, I heard that two or three people had these experiences, and that should now allow us to use those testimonials on our websites and talk about those in blogs and that type of thing, to where now you're creating doubt within the minds of the public whether or not this could actually be used beyond the label. And when it's promoted that way willfully, or by distributors that may be doing that where the manufacturer could reasonably know that that's happening. Maybe it's being subtly promoted. Maybe there's a Facebook page, or there's some other site that's not controlled directly by the manufacturer. Still, the manufacturer has the ultimate responsibility if if it's reasonable that they could be aware of that promotion, because that promotion belongs to the manufacturer.
Absolutely. And I mean, Shep, we're going to get into that in a minute,
Mhm.
talking about responsibility and accountability and who's
Right.
responsible for what. But one of the things that I hear all the time is that, you know, it's just a cosmetic. You know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
it's just a cosmetic. Like, who cares? So we're saying you're going to look younger in, 5 to 10 days.
Hmm.
Just put this on and woof, your wrinkles will disappear. You will be anti-aged. You will be, you know what I mean? And so I think for a lot of, especially people new to beauty, who are looking to get into it, founders, entrepreneurs, and investors, it's, and I just want to touch a little bit more on this, before we jump into the next
Hmm.
segment here. But it's really, really important that they understand it's irrelevant whether you want to remain as a cosmetic. You know what I mean? I understand you're not a pharmaceutical company. I understand you never intended to be a pharmaceutical company, and that's not that's not what you're here for. You're not making medical devices or drugs. Your intention is just to make cosmetics. But those intentions, I mean, especially with the influencers out there, especially with the TikToks of the world, there's a lot of stuff that's going on out there that, yes, you are responsible for. So I don't know if you want
Hmm.
to, if you want to respond to that whole, you know, we're just a cosmetic situation.
Well, it's the convenience of saying we're just a cosmetic because the cosmetic does not have the responsibility of all of the data requirements. So the cosmetic is something that's aesthetic, and it's a nice to have, not a need to have in terms of clinical benefit. However, when you start to associate clinical benefit with that nice to have as something, well, it would be really nice to be able to have this effect and also have something that is more towards need to have in terms of actual clinical benefit. That's where the line is crossed. It's not blurred, it's crossed. And that's where the liability happens. And do you get to go backwards from crossing that line? No, you've crossed the line. And that's the problem with people offering cosmetics, thinking that, well, I'll just see it. I'll see how far I can go with this. Well, you don't get a warning in advance of crossing the line. You get the warning after you've crossed the line, and then you basically that product is now no longer regulated as a cosmetic because you've made over the line claims in terms of clinical benefit that only a drug can make.
Right, right. And again, I want to stay on this topic of claims for a second before we
Mhm.
move on. But, I'll hear the argument. We can say it because we can claim it because we tested for it. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? I can make that claim because we did the testing. But,
Mhm.
when you're doing consumer testing, there's a very, very, it's a very different kind of test. You know what I mean? If you want to do the kind of three-phase testing, four-phase testing that drugs endure way before they come to market,
Mhm.
okay, be my guest, go for it. But just because you did a consumer, test on, I don't know, 30 people to see whether
Mhm.
they liked the feel of your product or whatever was written on your questionnaire. You know what I'm saying? That's you still can't make the claims of, you know what I mean, my product will, reduce wrinkles in X amount of time, or my product will, make you look at. Those are things that you can't say. And anti-aging is a very confusing term because in Europe, you can say things are anti-aging. You can put it on the label, you can write it on your bottle, you can say it. In the United States, you will get dinged for using the term anti-aging. So yes, even though we're going to talk about wordsmithing in a bit, you know what I mean? There is a fine line, you know what I mean? And you're walking that line. Go ahead.
We see anti-aging all the time, and yet anti-aging is clearly not a regulatory term. It's not a scientific term. Rejuvenation, not a scientific term. It's certainly pointing in the direction of what everyone would like to understand about the product and to see could it turn back the hands of time. That we don't have the capability of doing that, but it's nice to think in terms of a product that could make create an appearance of youthfulness. Now, there's a big difference between what you're alluding to, Melory, as the marketing study and a randomized clinical trial to support claims that the FDA will require. And the FDA doesn't let you get started with that without interaction with the FDA in advance, not afterwards or during. So you would go to the FDA and you'd talk about the protocol that you're intending to pursue for those claims, and you would see how the FDA views that and what they would like to see in addition or beyond what you're proposing in order to satisfy their panel to look at what it is that ultimately will satisfy the label. So and then what you could then take as labeling from that new label. So the indications as the basis for all that are what the FDA will look at to say, okay, are you supporting these or you're not supporting these? Not from a marketing study, but from a clinical trial in support. It's a regulatory study.
Okay. All right, so let's just move on because I that is a rabbit hole you can go down for hours. But and we've touched on it. We've used the term intended use a few times so far in our conversation. But just from a understanding, just so that the audience are following us here. So for clarity, how does it being the FDA, how does the FDA use labeling to determine a product's intended use, as we described earlier? Because in the end, it's going to be the FDA that determines your intended use if you are a pharmaceutical or a medical device. But for cosmetics, it's slightly different, although intended use is still pertinent here.
Right. So what the FDA is looking at, if you think that the FDA doesn't look at your website, if you think the FDA doesn't look at all the collateral that's surrounding your launch of your product or your support of the product in the marketplace, um, then you may just not be aware that that's exactly what they're doing. They may be doing it themselves directly, or they may be doing it in collaboration with the Federal Trade Commission. They may be doing it in collaboration with industry, with your competitors. So it may just be a variety of different inputs that they're receiving in terms of determining whether or not your intended use is in line with your stated label. And if it's beyond your label, then again, we're talking about off-label promotion. And to think that the FDA is not interested in what you're promoting the product with is very, very foolish and risky because it may take a while to get caught up with that, but ultimately you can be sure that the FDA does in fact prosecute those that are beyond their label. And I can tell you that in the year just passed, in 2025, I've been fully aware of those that thought that they were safely beyond their label, but because of the amount of time that they'd been doing that and the fact that everyone else is doing that, they were okay until they got the warning letter. And the warning letter is basically not like the type of a letter where you're just saying, "Oh, please don't do this anymore." It's a very, very different type of a action. It's essentially putting you out of business with that product within 15 days. So it's a warning letter is basically a termination of the product with very few exceptions. And once you have a warning letter, to try to make that warning letter go away is not a matter of days or weeks. It's a matter of typically several months, if not years.
And expensive. And
And
it's expensive.
expensive. Yes. And you're not selling in the meantime.
Yeah, right, right.
Right.
And look, I mean, it's you mentioned something there that you and I hear all the time, and that's this idea that well, everyone else is doing it. You know what I mean? Well, they're doing it. I saw them do it. Here's the thing. And I'm going to have you react to this in a second, but I always say you don't know what goes on behind closed doors. You don't know at this point what conversations they're having with the FDA. You don't
Mhm.
know what quality conversations they're having. You don't know how they've registered their product. Okay, sure, you can find out. But the point is, my grandma always used to say, if your friends jumped off the cliff, are you going to jump off the cliff too? You know what I mean? So, number one, you don't know whether they have a safety net. You know what I mean? Or what's going on behind their closed doors. And number two, why would you jump off the cliff if they're all jumping off the cliff? You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Stay on the ground. Safer. Go ahead, react to that.
No, absolutely. The thing is, you have to operate with what you understand and what's available in the Code of Federal Regulations. It's publicly available. It's there. It's in black and white, and that's what you operate with. You don't operate on the basis of the likelihood, or you may perceive the absence of likelihood of being prosecuted when you have no basis for that assurance. If you're running a business and you're expecting to be successful in the United States market, you need to understand the Code of Federal Regulations, how it's enforced, why it's enforced, and your compliance with it or absence of compliance with it. What we're doing right now is highlighting the consequences of the absence of compliance with it by understanding the difference between label and labeling. Labeling is where many times products get into trouble. Companies get into trouble by promoting products well beyond the label, and that happens every single day. It's unfortunate, but it doesn't mean that you're safe because others are doing it.
No, absolutely. And staying on the topic of, how the FDA sees the world. I know I mentioned earlier, but can you elaborate on what types of materials the FDA considers labeling beyond packaging? And like I said, I know that we did mention it, but I think it is worth, repeating that just for clarity's sake.
I think when we think about what's used to promote, look at websites and social media sites, brochures, instructions for use, sales decks, training materials, influencer claims, and then beyond. Actually, you could be speaking and getting recorded, and the idea that that recording is not printed material. However, you could look at that as being translated, or with closed captioning, it could be actually, there could be a transcript of that that becomes printed material. And you may think, well, I just was talking off the cuff, or, this wasn't official, or this type of thing. If you're making it possible for someone to make a decision about the purchasing of your product that is beyond your label, that's off-label promotion, and that is where you go afoul of the
And
FDA.
and you know what, and that scares me because I don't think people realize, entrepreneurs, founders, especially new to this and not even new to this industry, people have been doing this a long time. Well, you've got influencers out there. I understand they're marketing your product. I understand they're pushing it on TikTok and Insta and all the other social media platforms, but you are responsible for what they say about your product. You know
Right.
what I mean? It's not just, you can't just say, well, they said it. I have no, I'm not responsible for the things I say, or a thumbs up or a like on something outrageous that somebody had to say about your product, or, and all of those things fall under the materials that the FDA, considers labeling.
Correct. Exactly. A lot of people think that the distance by having someone else launch a site or someone else speak at a meeting about your product, if it's a complete surprise, that will be something that it was, you could say, well, then you have to
Well, you
ensure
have
that
to
that
address
individual
it.
that made
Yeah,
the
you have to
surprising
address it there
statement.
and then,
Right,
right?
that there will be
Yeah,
consequences
yeah.
for that person doing off-label promotion of your product, because at the end of the day, you have the responsibility for your product. But if that person is, if it's tacitly accepted, there's no evidence that person was doing it on your behalf, but it's pretty obvious that you're uh, deriving benefit from that regardless. I mean, and you could be reasonably aware of that promotion. You still have the ultimate responsibility, and that's where 801.4 of the Code of Federal Regulations for Medical Device Intended Uses is very important. It's not just um, uh, that you were aware of the intended uses, but you could also be reasonably aware of what others that are putting the product into the market on your behalf are saying. And that's so you have ultimate responsibility.
No, absolutely. And I want to just talk a little bit about where brands get into trouble. Um, because this is where things get tricky since most regulatory problems don't start with bad intentions. You know
Hmm.
what they say about the road to hell, but they start with someone trying to be helpful, efficient, cost conscious, whatever it is. Somebody has some good
Hmm.
intentions without fully appreciating how regulators interpret language. In other words, this is where theory meets reality. And I'm going to give you, the audience, a real example, anonymized, of course, that illustrates how quickly labels and labeling can go sideways.
Hmm.
So there was a contract manufacturer once who tried to help a brand by wordsmithing their way around regulation. So the problem was is that this wasn't this wasn't a shampoo. It wasn't a cleanser. This was a tattoo cream that was being marketed online as antimicrobial for use during and immediately after tattooing. Okay,
Hmm.
so the contract manufacturer presented the brand with an option to position it as a cosmetic. to avoid the cost and complexity of drug or device requirements. But here's the reality. One, the product was being used on broken skin. Two, it was intended to prevent infection. Remember how it was being marketed. And three, it was marketed for use during a medical adjacent procedure. This is used for tattooing. But all of what I just described makes this wound care, not cosmetics. In the
Hmm.
United States, that immediately raises drug and potentially medical device considerations. So, to make matters worse, the product at the time was being manufactured in a home kitchen. And I know that sounds crazy, but, particularly people who are coming from a non-cosmetic background, but many, many, many entrepreneurs start in their home kitchen where they have their ingredients under their kitchen sink that's kept next to the Fabuloso. You don't know what contamination has, crossed over into those ingredients for one. But what sounded like a benign branding decision quickly became a full-blown regulatory nightmare. Misclassifications, GMP violations. Remember, this was coming from CM's advice,
Hmm.
patient safety risk, and serious enforcement exposure. This is exactly why labeling matters, because regulators look at use, claims, context, and risk, not just how a product is described on paper. So, Shep, you and I have both had our fair share, experienced our fair share of horror stories. In
Yes.
your experience, though, where do companies most often get into trouble with labeling, even when the on-pack label looks compliant?
Well, it's interesting because the on-pack label can be compliant, as we say. I mean, it could be the last thing if ever anyone sees about the product. Um, what happens is the labeling around that is what is guilty of adulteration and misbranding, where you're taking things that, and those are the two terms, by the way, and this they're used actually as the same words, but with slightly different intents by both the FDA and then also the Federal Trade Commission. So basically, if you're saying something about your product that is in the labeling is incorrect. I mean, it could even be not for promotion purposes, but just simply to describe it incorrectly. You are already over the line in terms of adulteration of the product, which they consider that the product is adulterated because now it's being understood to be something besides what it is, regardless of promotional purpose, and misbranding because you're not accurately representing the product. So in those situations, the FDA will still come down with strong enforcement activity. Again, in my experience, it happens because what the FDA is trying to do is prevent confusion in the public, especially, I mean, and the public also includes clinically trained professionals that are seeing something that's intended to be for prescription only could still be confused. But even more broadly, the public, the over-the-counter promotion to the general public, that is where the risks are the greatest because the public can be confused. The public can be making a decision about the product on the basis of the adulteration, on the basis of the misbranding, to the point that they're self-selecting something incorrectly. And it was that incorrect decision was aided by the manufacturer or contract manufacturer because of departure from the label. So this is where the FDA spends extraordinary resources to investigate and prosecute to make sure that they are doing their mission to protect the public. So bottom line is look at your label as your line of departure. You don't go across that. You stay within that label. You can support with creative words and testimonials, that type of thing, things that are on label. That's completely acceptable and is what you are constrained to do. Essentially, those that don't do that ultimately do pay an extraordinary price. Very rarely do they survive that price. And so it's important to understand that it's not a risk of having to pay a fine or I mean, in some cases, a recall of the product is oftentimes is the product itself is now banned. And if it's upregulated, it's you could look at that as essentially a short detour towards being banned in the United States. The upregulation is rarely supportable by the organization that would engage in off-label promotion in the first place. So essentially, it's a very, very short detour. It's approximately a 15-day detour to being banned in the United States. And so the product will be suddenly removed from the market. It's an extraordinarily abrupt process, and it's certainly not worth the risks.
No, absolutely. And I mean, and for those watching and listening, don't think for one single second that because we're talking cosmetics, when we're in the cosmetics world, the beauty world, that this doesn't apply to you.
Mhm.
Because, recalls happen and recalls are costly, and there are some mistakes that are you can, you can certainly recover from, but there are others that a company just can't. The reputational damage is it's too, it's too much. But what's important here, especially for non-US companies, is that this isn't unique to the FDA. Whether you're dealing with EU regulators, MHRA, Health Canada, or any other international regulatory body, intended use, in this case, we're talking about cosmetics, that's your
Mhm.
intended use. So, your intended use, your claims, and your claims will drive classification.
Mhm.
So, you want to make sure your intended use remains within the description that the FDA has of cosmetics. The mechanisms worldwide may differ, but the principle is the same, that no matter where you are, you cannot market or wordsmith your way out of regulatory reality. The distinction, label versus labeling, has real consequences, as Shep just described. Before I ask you the next question, though, Shep, I want to clarify something that surprises a lot of people new to regulation. When regulators talk about labeling, they're not just talking about the words printed on a bottle or box, as we've been talking about. In
Mhm.
regulatory terms, claims are labeling. And if you haven't picked this up so far, maybe now's the point to rewind and listen to this again. Everything that we've been saying are claims that you're making about your product. Any statement you make about what a product does, what it helps with, how it works, why someone should use it, why they should buy it, is considered labeling. Those are your claims. Although I mentioned this before, I think it's worth emphasizing that labeling includes your website copy, social media posts, influencer content, yes, ads, emails, FAQs, testimonials, and how your sales teams, customer service teams describe your products. So if a brand says that's just my marketing, please know that regulators don't see it that way. From
Right.
their perspective, if a consumer can see it, read it, or hear it, and it describes your product, it counts as labeling. These are your claims. This is what you're claiming about your product. You're telling consumers these are the reasons that they should buy your product and use your product. And this is where you can get into trouble. Even when the physical label looks compliant, if your claims or labeling made anywhere and everywhere else are not, they can quietly override what's on your package. Once you understand that claims are labeling, a lot of enforcement actions suddenly make a lot more sense. So, Shep, with that content, can you please explain how claims outside the package often become the biggest regulatory risk and where brands most commonly underestimate that exposure?
Let me focus on probably the biggest source of misunderstanding on that. And that is where on the website, I mean, this happens so often as to become proverbial that testimonials are offered. And the bigger and bolder the testimonial, the better, except it's actually the riskier. Because why would you put that testimonial on the site? The site is there to face the public. The public is making a decision about the purchase of your product. They're seeing that somebody had this amazing experience with the product. Why does the public need to know about that person's experience as they're relating it back to the company, other than to uh, confuse the public to think maybe I, in purchasing that product, will have the same experience as this person who made this bold testimonial? And so the FDA looks at that and saying, okay, you're taking this as advertising, that you're taking this as labeling, you're taking this experience that was shared with you by someone, rightly or wrongly, correctly or incorrectly, on the basis of science or on the basis of no science, and broadcasting that publicly to people that will purchase the product on the basis of something that is now becoming an expectation that is irrational and at a minimum is illegal. So we don't want to be guilty of that. And the FDA will look at that and say, it doesn't matter that they had this experience or they didn't have that experience. If you're using that to promote your product illegally, that's what we're here to prevent. That's what we're here to stop. And so if you're confused about that, just because of the fact that there are so many websites out there with so many testimonials and claims like that, understand that those are all at risk. Those are all in jeopardy of enforcement action. And you don't hear so much about the enforcement actions because they're not as publicly available as being aware of the ones that are violating right now. So you look at like on the freeway, you look at the speeders and you think, oh my gosh, these people are speeding. You're not seeing necessarily all the ones that are getting caught. You're seeing the ones that are not getting caught and thinking that nobody's getting caught. I can assure you that many, many, many are getting caught and paying the ultimate price of losing their ability to sell a product in the United States.
No, absolutely. And again, I'm going to go back to that example I used before because I just think it was just such a dangerous road to be going down, the tattoo cream, because here you had, person who had good intention. He
Mhm.
was creating, he's an artist who wants to use something in his shop, so he made it in his kitchen, keeping all the ingredients under his kitchen sink along with everything else. And he was making it what was essentially antimicrobial wound care,
Mhm.
and he was getting wonderful testimonials. Yes, they were his friends. Yes, they were, you know what I mean? But the general public doesn't know that. They want to buy his product. They want to put it on their open wounds. And you can only imagine the dangers he was putting these people under. And like I said before, this isn't a problem for just for newcomers.
Mhm.
The person who was encouraging him to promote this or continue to promote it as a cosmetic was his contract manufacturer.
Mhm.
So, I don't know if you want to react to that before we move on, but I just think that again, that is a great example of how, because it's one thing to be selling a shampoo, right? No one's going to be saying, unless the shampoo is going to be, I don't know, regrowing your hair, that's a drug, people. Or your cleanser is going to be used to prevent acne, that's a drug claim. It's, Shep, I don't know if you want to go ahead and respond to that before we move on.
Well, I'll just say at the end of the day, it's not the contract manufacturer that's going to be facing prosecution. They may have a slight role in you could say aiding and abetting the transgression, but at the same time, it's the manufacturer. It's the one whose label is ultimately going on the product, has full responsibility, and that cannot be outsourced. That cannot be diverted. And the FDA doesn't look beyond the manufacturer in terms of who faces full prosecution, who faces full liability.
Yep. All right. Well, let's go down this road. Because there's another misconception that I see globally, and that's the idea that regulatory risk sits with whoever wrote the copy. In reality, though, regulators don't care who drafted the
Mhm.
language. They
Mhm.
care who put it on the product and who put
Right.
that product on the market. And this isn't just, like I said, a new founder problem. We're now crossing over into the territory of CMOs and marketing agencies and
Mhm.
consultants who create content. So Shep, who actually owns ultimately the regulatory risk associated with those labels and labeling?
The manufacturer. It doesn't, you can contract people that will maybe perhaps want to satisfy you. I would even say that generative AI is very good at trying to satisfy you, doing things that will make you happy. But at the same time, it's not in line necessarily with what you should be doing. It's what you want to see, what is responsive to your desires, but not necessarily what you ought to be thinking about. And so, if you're thinking, well, I should be trying to sue ChatGPT, or I should be trying to sue the consultant or whatnot. Well, good luck, because that's not going to do anything other than waste your time. It certainly won't benefit you in any way with regard to the regulations and with regard to the enforcement actions coming from the FDA.
So let's just continue on this thought on the fallacy of outsourcing accountability,
Mhm.
because again, I see that all the time. Um,
Mhm.
what should brands demand from their partners to protect themselves? And I mean, their partners are not just CMOs. Like I said, they could be marketing agents or even consultants.
Well, the interesting thing is the FDA actually does have its own educational line, basically for the medical device side, the Division of Industry and Consumer Education, or DICE. And you can call them, you can write them, and you can find out information immediately. Or you can just make sure that you're working with a trusted regulatory affairs consultant, someone that already has an extraordinary history with the FDA over a long period of time, and it will not misguide you. So I would say working with the FDA itself directly is you can get bits and pieces. You can get quick answers, yes, no, oftentimes, or you can get guided to guidance. Sometimes they'll send you to a website, or they'll send you to a guidance document that you can read. Is the guidance always crystal clear? It's not always crystal clear. It does require interpretation, does require knowing what they mean when they're writing things. And so that may entail the benefit of a trusted regulatory affairs consultant to help turn it into plain English for you. But at the same time, these are the things that you must do in advance of entering the market, just so that you're not in jeopardy.
And I mean, is there something that from those partners, let's just talk CM at this point for argument's
Mhm.
sake, that a brand can demand to protect themselves?
Well, essentially, a CM should never have any responsibility for the label beyond what the manufacturer is directing. So that would be in terms of a strong agreement. Nothing can be changed without the approval, the explicit review and approval of the manufacturer. So the contract manufacturer is under contract. The contract needs to be clear and complete and current and understandable, so that any sort of change would be beyond the explicit acceptance and approval of the manufacturer. If a contract manufacturer were to do something in violation of that agreement, then the contract manufacturer would have actually violated its agreement and have transgressed. But the idea is that the contract manufacturer should never um, be operating outside of the boundaries of an explicit agreement with the manufacturer. The manufacturer is the specification developer, is the company that's ultimately the owner of the product.
Okay.
Mhm.
So let's just talk quickly to investors and operators, and let's talk about final takeaways here.
Mhm.
And let's make this practical, because this is where investors and operators need to pay attention. Labeling risk doesn't just create compliance issues, it creates business risk. Misclassification can mean recalls, as we talked about, seized inventory, halted manufacturing, reputational damage. Again, I touched on that earlier. And in some cases, even personal liability. It's
Yes.
important that you know these things. So the question becomes, how do you prevent this early? Shep, if you were advising an investor or a board member about labeling red flags, what concerns should be raised immediately?
You look at the market, first of all, understand what does the market support. If you're Everyone wants to be highly innovative. Everyone wants to be coming out with something new and as sort of a breakthrough, or something that's novel and uncompeted. And that is understandable and desirable, but you need to understand the basis for that. Is what you're offering that's novel, is it so novel that it's actually incredible, meaning not credible, to the point that you're entering into a realm of risk because of the fact that you don't have the basis for supporting the innovation. Often innovation, highly desirable, as we all want new and better, highly innovative products, require not days and weeks, but months and years of research to confirm. It's not that you saw something, the flash in the pan once, it's that you've been able to repeat that flash and in such a fashion that will convince regulators. Otherwise, you don't have the basis for entering the market without that corresponding risk. All the FDA would like to see is the solid evidence. And under best business practices, under good scientific principles, what are the bases of offering that label that then can allow you to do the labeling to make those claims? All of this is very, very doable. You can look at this as something as due diligence in advance of entering the market. What investors, what creditors, what anyone that's supporting a company that's entering the market with a highly innovative or novel product needs to be thinking about is, why is it novel? And how do you support the novelty? If it's novel because you've got testimonials, that's probably a red flag. If it's novel because you've got some actual science behind it and you're looking at things in a different way that's credible and is applying the scientific principle that is understandable universally across the entire world, then that's worth taking a look at and then protecting it with good patents and then making sure that you're on a good regulatory pathway that's supportable with conversations with regulators before you enter the market, at the time that you're entering the market, and then at all times after you enter the market.
Okay. So just, in simple terms, is there some kind of a simple system that a company could put in place to reduce these types of risks early?
Well, absolutely. You take a look at what's supportable with guidance. I mean, that's the passive way. The active way is with pre-market, you could say pre-submission meetings. And the cost of a pre-submission meeting is nothing. It's just your time and possibly travel if you're going to do it in person. But those are cheap insurance. The FDA offers pre-submission discussions that can be purely by correspondence. It can be by Zoom for government or Teams for government, or it can be in person. I find that the in person is the best because you actually get the best level of communication with those that are going to be ultimately making the decision. And you can lay out exactly what it is that you're intending to do. And then it takes all the sport out of it because now you know what are the boundaries. And oftentimes, what you can glean from guidance will be most of it, but may not be all of it. So you want to make sure that you're being circumspect and thorough with regard to the labeling that you're intending to make as you're proceeding with your label. I
Okay.
always talk about I always talk about the label in terms of let's get a new and better label with the understanding that that label will be the basis of the labeling.
Also, for those watching and listening, you know, we talk about cosmetics and we talk about cosmetics, crossing over into drugs and,
Mhm.
what's an OTC versus what's a cosmetic. But there's another thing in beauty that people need to remember is that a lot of beauty crosses over into medical devices as well.
Mhm.
Beauty doesn't just begin and end at, creams and cleansers. A
Mhm.
lot of beauty encompasses medical devices. So,
Mhm.
all of what Shep is talking about here might apply to the medical device as in the medical device, but
Mhm.
sometimes you're crossing over into a medical device with some of the instruments and some of the devices that you want to bring onto the market from a beauty standpoint.
Mhm.
So, this is, all of these kinds of things. My suggestion is, like Sheppard said before, get a regulatory team, do your due diligence, try to get, there are great companies out there. And again, if you're struggling and you don't know, send me a message, send Shep a message. We can always help you. If we can't help you
Absolutely.
ourselves, we can point you in the right direction. And then that person that you contract or that team that you contract can then help you take your product to the next level, whether it's to go directly to the FDA, like Shep has mentioned, or, you know what I mean, or, at least try to navigate this sea of contract manufacturers to choose from.
Mhm.
There's a lot, there's a lot that you can do by choosing the right team to back you from a regulatory perspective. Shep, before I close off here, is there anything you want to add? Any last minute thoughts?
I would just say, it's difficult to oftentimes uh, satisfy everybody. It's a bit of a compromise, and often it seems like you're understating what you would like to offer. But the safest and the most successful route is being conservative, is keeping your understanding, your counsel, in terms of knowing what it is that you can legally claim. You don't want to wake up and realize, oh my gosh, I'm the recipient of a warning letter. I have 15 days to figure out how to satisfy something that could most likely not be satisfied. The bottom line is that I've been told now that I've violated the my you know my product offering. I violated the call it the privilege of offering this product into the United States market. And so I would just say, please understand that we recognize that it is a bit of a compromise at all times, but at the same time, it's the compromise that's well worth making so that you can step by step gather the data, do the work, get in line with the broader label, the bigger label, and I'm saying label, so that you can then make those extraordinary claims. We all want to see bigger, better products, but we know that in order to see the bigger, better products, it takes the hard work of doing the research and getting the clinical feedback and having the scientific basis for expanding the label and then allowing the labeling to support better products.
So, for everyone watching and listening, what this conversation really underscores is that labeling is not a marketing exercise. It's a regulatory decision with legal consequences.
Right.
The hard truth, regulatory risk isn't just about what's printed on the label. It's about everything a company communicates about its product. While the details vary by region and the takeaway is universal, you can't wordsmith your way around intended use. Understanding that early is what separates companies that scale responsibly from those that learn the hard way. If you found this episode helpful, please like it and subscribe on YouTube so I can continue these expert conversations. Also, you can now find this show on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Melory Johnson. Thank you for watching and listening, and I'll see you all next time.